I declare open this public hearing of the Senate Select Committee on the National Broadband Network. I welcome you all here today. In the room we have Senator Scott Ludlam, Senator David Johnson, we have Senator Stephen Conroy coming down from the heavens. Morning, Stephen.
G'day, everybody.
And I'm Jan McLucas, I'm the chair of the committee. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made. Before the committee starts taking evidence, I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence being given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. I would like to emphasise that while the committee prefers all evidence to be given in public, under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to request to be heard in private session. If you would like any of your evidence to be heard in camera, please don't hesitate to let the committee know. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground on which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. As noted previously, such a request may be made at any other time. Gentlemen, that is a standard set of words that is said in front of every committee. We are not expecting this to be a difficult hearing at all. I remind people in the hearing room to ensure that their mobile phones are either switched off or switched to silent. I welcome the academics who are appearing today for the academic roundtable: Dr. Gregory, Dr. Glance, Dr. Tucker, Professor Tucker, Professor Nirmalathas, Professor Lowery. For the record, could you give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Mark Gregory, I'm a senior lecturer at RMIT University.
Thank you.
Dr. David Glance, I'm the director of the UWA Centre for Software Practice.
I'm Rod Tucker and I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Melbourne.
Nirmalathas, I'm a director of the Melbourne Network Society Institute and also the academic director for the Melbourne Accelerator Program.
I'm Arthur Lowery. I'm an ARC Laureate Fellow at Monash University.
Thank you. I will now ask each of you if you would like to make an opening statement, or as Professor Lowery calls it, a speech-ette, which I think is quite cute. So who would like to begin?
Well,
Professor Lowery.
I've put my hand up, so I guess I'm in the firing line now.
Thank you.
So good morning, senators and academics and members of the public out there. My name's Arthur Lowery. I'm an ARC Laureate Fellow in electrophotonic interchanges. They're the freeway network for optical communications, the backbone. I'm a long-time systems engineer and a fellow of the IEEE for leadership in software tools for communication systems design. More importantly to you is that I co-founded a company called VPI Systems in 1996, a company that has driven innovation and rollouts in optical communications around the world by developing software tools across the bandwidth value chain, i.e. for component designers, network equipment manufacturers, operators and service providers. Why is this important? Well, because VPI supports optimized engineering by selecting the optimum mix of technologies to provide services, your new plan for the NBN. Many companies and countries have benefited from these planning tools. And I should add, I have no financial interest in VPI anymore. I've read your report on the old plan and the new plan, and I agree with most of the text and recommendations. Good engineering is about optimization by considering all available technologies, including considerations throughout the life cycle: upgradability, maintenance, suitability, return on investment, financing. Most importantly, for complex projects like these, the engineering decisions should be supported by vendor-neutral software. From my experience of building an even smallish software team of 100 people, it's extremely difficult to recruit enough engineering experts to make the right decisions. I really don't know how you could have done this, as you need the experts to interview the experts. And the reports allude to this. It's also difficult to attract the best engineers when they know they'll be redundant after the build. For the last 12 years, I've been working on new types of optical system at Monash University. We're developing optical chips to lower the cost and energy consumption of complex optical networks. In 2008, I founded a company called Ophidium, which holds key IP in access and long-haul systems. I'm also leading the development of a cortical implant to provide bionic vision and a recording brain interface to enable bidirectional communications to prosthetics, for example. My next mission in optics is to roll out a 10 terabit per second research network which will connect RMIT, Melbourne and Monash universities to allow us to perfect very high performance optical switching and processing together so we can develop solutions for real world problems. I sincerely believe that more thinking is required on the NBN. For example, it's easy to imagine hybrid methods that could cut billions from the cost of NBN while still providing the enormous download speeds associated with fibre. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lowery.
Thank you. This is Nirmalathas from the Network Society Institute. I would like to make a very quick couple of points. I guess we approach the challenge society faces through the network society lens, where the ICT technologies pretty much kind of decide every aspect of the society, from production to labor to the cultural aspect of the society. So we see that as a very powerful framework to see how the Australia could develop itself, both in region as well as within the cities. So the NBN is an important platform for activating that connectivity, because we are really interested in using connectivity between people, places, and things as a way of running the society efficiently. In that context, I think the investment in NBN should be world-class. And I think one of the things we see, despite the NBN implementation, our international ranking has been a bit of a struggle for us to lift. If you look at it, there is a widening gap between the peak and the average speeds as the network builds up. The average speed is improving over the years, but other countries have been systematically able to improve much greater rate than we've been able to do. So there is a potential that people who have it and people don't have it, there is a widening gap in that context. So while the NBN promises us a lot of opportunities for improving, but accelerating that NBN rollout is a kind of critical step so that we can reap the benefits offered by this concept called as Internet of Things, where we actually have a pervasive network of devices, people, and systems where we can drive different industry sectors. And in that, if you look at it, we are also at the risk of, if you look at the revised NBN deployment plans, the greenfield sites and the brownfield sites, there has been significant down projections of the rollout plan. And I see there is some statistics we need to publish more openly so that we can see how we are doing. For example, the greenfield sites, I think there is about 100 I think it's about 200,000 new premises come on board in terms of registration within Australia. But in terms of the greenfield deployment, it is at much lower rate. So there is a risk of converting today's greenfield sites into the accumulating backlog of brownfield sites if we are not making them NBN activated pretty much immediately as the premises come on board. And these challenges could possibly delay the Australia's capacity to embrace the Internet of Things, in particular in the regions and towns, because Australia can't just see the development by looking at only major cities. The major cities are surrounded by larger regional cities, and the regional cities are surrounded by towns. We have to see it as a connected city framework so that we can see both culture, economy, labor distribution, and also housing and development, all as a connected city kind of framework. And I think it is great to see in recent times that connected city focus is actually on the government's priority. But I think we need to really accelerate NBN as a launchpad for really being able to help the industry to reap the benefits. In that regard, even the satellite deployment, it's already the deployment plan looks like we might actually very quickly hit again a shortfall, and we should be looking at third satellite launch in order to really enable the IoT in regions and town villages. With that, I might just stop there.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Tucker, did you have some...
Well, I hadn't planned to make a statement, but I've now been stimulated by my colleague, Vplus. And I'd like to make the point, just picking up on something that he said, that we need to be planning for the future. And if one looks at the capacity of broadband networks around the world, and I've been doing quite a lot of work on this in recent years, it's true that Australia is falling behind the rest of the world in terms of broadband capabilities. We are currently about 49th in the world. And by projections that I've been looking at, it's possible that we could even hit 100th in the world, even with the NBN coming on stream. So we certainly need to be thinking about the future. And I think the important point here is that all around the world, the demand for bandwidth is growing, and it always has been growing. Ever since the days of the dial-up modems, there has been an exponential growth in the capacity required by people and the bandwidth that's been used and the data downloaded. And that exponential growth is not stopping. So even though we might have sufficient capacity now or in the near future with the NBN, we need to be thinking further ahead, in the sense that in another 10 or 20 years that exponential growth will continue, and there'll be a need to make sure the NBN can be upgraded to a capacity that will be needed in the future. So I think we need to keep this in our minds, that we're looking over the long term, well into the future, in terms of the engineering decisions we make now.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Tucker. Dr. Glance.
Well, following on from Rod's comments, yes, I wasn't going to say anything, but so I thought, just in case the question doesn't come up, in the past 10 years I've been involved in rolling out clinical systems to a variety of different locations, including rural areas. And the problems and difficulties that we encountered in doing that are still prevalent today, in terms of having to rely on satellite systems to provide access for these communities and the clinicians that provide the care there. So these weren't particularly exceptional demands. They were things like uploading retinal images, for example, so that somebody in Perth could actually review and make a diagnosis. It was trying to do video conferencing for a GP to access specialist care. In places like Kununurra, it might be actually performing an operation whilst getting assistance over video conferencing at the same time. All of those things became incredibly difficult to deliver, even when we went to extreme lengths to get business-grade satellite provisions. We've been in the situation in Darwin, for example, outside the detention centres there, where every time an aeroplane landed and everybody switched on their cell phones, the actual clinical systems went down because they couldn't get the bandwidth through the 4G network that was available at the time. So these are actually not particularly futuristic scenarios. They are scenarios that we've actually been tackling and trying to deliver systems today, and they don't encompass the sort of demands, as Rod has mentioned, Professor Tucker has mentioned, in terms of the future requirements. So if we're going to deliver care to the home, for example, which increasingly is one of the requirements in terms of video conferencing, we're not going to do it. Having just set up a ADSL connection for a neighbour and seen a commercial offering which is at most 6 megabits per second, it's clear that we can't rely on private enterprise to deliver this infrastructure and this functionality. So that is one of the critical features of what any infrastructure needs to be able to deliver.
Thank you, Dr. Glance. Dr. Gregory.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to make a few comments a little bit more specific about things related to the NBN, if I may. I'd like to start with something which I consider to be very important that relates to the conduct of the NBN, and that is that it's very important to understand that the current telecommunications market in Australia is very unbalanced. We made an error and we missed the opportunity to split Telstra into two companies back in a decade ago. We still have an opportunity to do that, as our colleagues across the ditch in New Zealand have demonstrated to us in 2012. It would mean that there would need to be a reorganisation of how retail and wholesale work, but this is something that the Senate committee should consider, because it's most embarrassing to have New Zealand show us the way in anything. It is important that the ACCC maintain its monopoly infrastructure role. I know there has been discussion and talk about this role being removed from the ACCC. It would be a mistake. We've seen errors like this before that have caused chaos that have taken decades to restore. And I also strongly support the ACCC's call for monitoring, performance monitoring of the NBN. It's very much a case that we need to differentiate where the problems lie. Is the problem something that is responsibility of NBN Co, or the responsibility of the retail service providers? And technically it's only due to performance monitoring and identifying where congestion is that we'll be able to identify where the responsibility lies. Now, if I may, in regards to NBN Co, NBN Co should not be able to discriminate on pricing of products. The way that NBN Co has been trying to slowly do this with the aid of recent legislation that's been pulled from the agenda is wrong. At this stage, the goal has got to be to get the NBN rolled out. Let's worry about finessing competitive markets and the implications of what that does later, after we've got a firm basis upon which we can move forward. We need the NBN Co to roll out a wholesale Wi-Fi network, and we need this desperately, because unless the government is asleep, everyone should notice that Telstra has been expending huge amounts of money on Telstra Air. Now, Telstra has been signing up councils around Australia exclusively to the Telstra Air network. And what this means is that Telstra are expending funds in such a way that they are gaining a creep on what you would call community or public or national Wi-Fi. Now, technologies coming down the pike for Wi-Fi are going to be very important. In the next 10 years, Wi-Fi is not going to be what we think it is now. Wi-Fi and the changes in that wireless area, including the introduction of LTE into the 2.4, 5 gigahertz and other bands, means that we're going to have a very, very complementary environment between wireless and fixed networks. And the people at Telstra know what they're doing. It's very important that a life cycle cost analysis be done for fibre to the node, HFC and fibre to the premise. If this was done at the start rather than a fantasy cost-benefit analysis, we would have very easily seen that there was no reason to build fibre to the node. We saw recently that AT&T conducted such a study, and AT&T have published the results. And their results clearly show that fibre to the premise is the way forward. We now see in the United States companies only talking about fibre, not talking about fibre to the node or anything else, only about fibre. And that's because they carried out the correct engineering study. NBN Co unfortunately has some problems, and the Media and Communications Group is leading the way. The relationship between the Media and Communications Group at NBN Co and organisations that are not responsive to their point of view is very negative. And this has been highlighted by people before, in particular the leadership of NBN Co's Media and Communications Group. In January this year, after 4 years of a very, very good relationship with NBN Co and being able to visit many NBN sites, I've been to probably 15 or more over that period of time, including locations such as Darwin, Geraldton, Queensland, Sydney, Melbourne and so forth, Tasmania. I was sent an email telling me that I was to no longer to be provided with any support by NBN Co, that I was to be no longer provided with any responses to questions that I had from NBN Co, and that NBN Co was not interested in academia. NBN Co has 60 or more people in their Media and Communications Group around the country. I find it amazing that we can't afford one person out of such a large organisation with such a large budget to be a relationship manager to deal with academia. If we don't research, if we don't inquire, then we, academics, are failing. But more to the point, government has failed us. I would like to just move from that very negative point to something I believe that is very positive. I think it's very important that we look ahead. And one way or another, we're only 5 years away from, hopefully, from the end of the NBN rollout. I would like to encourage the committee to recommend government that we form a broad panel now, consisting of people from industry, government, consumer advocates, academia, to look at what should happen to the NBN post 31st of December 2020. This is going to be one of the most important decisions, most important public infrastructure decisions in this nation's history, if not the most important public infrastructure decision in this nation's history. We need to talk about it now. The next 5 years are going to pass very quickly. We need to form a consensus view on the future for the NBN. It's time that the NBN stopped being a political football. It has been the most disappointing thing in my career to see the NBN turn into something which detracts from what people, the engineers, are doing at NBN Co, which is excellent work. I've expressed in a number of different forums and ways very strong views on the NBN. All I'm concerned about is that we get the best value for the Australian public moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gregory. There's a number of themes that have come out of your original comments, and I wonder if, Deputy Chair, we could sort of think about having a conversation around the NBN, the comments you've just made, Dr. Gregory. I want to pursue Dr. Glance's comments around health and the NBN. That's my personal sort of interest, but I don't want to put my personal interest in front of everyone else. Other themes that people might want to progress, Senator Ludlam?
Today?
Yeah, with the group of academics that we have here today.
I've got two themes that I'd like to progress. So the idea of this hearing really was to put fresh eyes on the NBN. The debate's got pretty stale and pretty stuck, and it's right down in the weeds, was to really have you guys give us a bit of a helicopter view. Anything that you can tell us by way of global comparisons of what our, contemporary or like-minded countries might be putting into the field, and really where you think this should go from here. Like, all of you have written extensively on, quite sharp critiques of where we've got to. If we can pull the political football off the field today and talk about where to from here. I mean, you're in Parliament House, it is a political environment, but this is a project that's got to survive political cycles. So that was the intention, really. We haven't called Telstra, we haven't called NBN today. We've called people who don't normally get to front these sort of forums.
Thanks. Stephen, are there any themes that you would like to progress? I'm just trying to get some structure around the next hour or so. No. All right, well, let's talk about the now, then we'll talk about the future stuff, and then we'll talk about health and whatever else comes up as a theme as well.
Chair, I'd like to talk about what other countries are doing.
Okay, so the global comparisons. Right, NBN, NBN now. I'm particularly concerned at your comments, Dr. Gregory, about non-engagement with NBN and them not being interested in talking to academia. But let's sort of progress those conversations that we had, that Dr. Gregory raised about what we need to do now, and pick up on the comments that you made. Dr. Gregory, when you were engaging with NBN, what was the value to your work, to the NBN, to the community of your engagement?
I feel that my engagement with NBN was very positive, because not only could it be folded back into my teaching and research at RMIT University, but also in discussions with my colleagues. But also, it also provides value in terms of providing a different perspective on what's happening with this project. I've looked back at how academics were involved in the Snowy Mountains scheme and other large projects that we've had over our history. And there seems to be less interaction today between academia and some of the major things that have been going on over our history. And of course, we've recently seen reviews of the Sydney Opera House. And of course, at the time that Opera House is being built, there was a huge amount of interaction between academia, the builders, the government, and so forth. A mountain of interaction, positive and negative and so forth. So what I would like to say is that I think that the debate is important. It's not that one side is wrong and the other side is right. It's that through the debate we all learn, and knowledge provides strength.
And any other comments? Please, let's turn this into a conversation rather than a...
This is Nirmalathas, and I think the last 2 years I've been closely engaging with NBN on more technology side of it. So I think we found it, some of the teams, very responsive, interactive, and very soon I think we will host a major technology delegation back into the university to look at some of the emerging challenges, emerging applications that we're doing inside the lab. So I find it easier to approach NBN technical teams, and we've been collaborating with them.
Oh, good. Any other comments?
Well, Chair, I think this is a really great opportunity to talk to some people who have a very broad view, both domestically and internationally. And I'm interested to talk about fibre to the node and fibre to the premise. And in the very brief but intense period of time that I tried to come to terms with what is a very deep technological, cultural subject, I note that some countries around the world are doing things, UK, Germany, US, Switzerland are doing fibre to copper. Now, I'm interested in what potential there is to meet Dr. Gregory and Professor Tucker's ambitions for the future. So my question is, how are those rollouts going? How do they differ from ours? And what is the upgradable potential for us, given what we're doing right now, into the future, the 2020, 2030 conundrum and challenge that I think has been put on the table by particularly you, Professor Tucker. So I'm happy for you to try and tell us where you think we're at in terms of what they're doing and what we're doing.
Perhaps I could start. You mentioned a moment ago the fibre to the node in the United States, and I think it's important to recognise the fact that in the past 3 years since the change of management in NBN Co, the whole scene in the US has changed. 3 years ago, and up to a point 3 years ago, in the US there were two companies that were taking two different directions. One was Verizon, which was rolling out fibre to the premises, and the other was AT&T that was rolling out fibre to the node. And this was happening around the time of the global financial crisis, and Verizon tapered out their rollout, whereas AT&T continued with fibre to the node.
And they've done this engineering report that we've heard about.
But since then, it's all changed, and in the last 3 years, there's been a total turnaround. And AT&T has totally stopped fibre to the node, and they've done a complete conversion to fibre to the premises. And this has been driven by a recognition of the fact that they were, well, I guess primarily on competitive grounds, because there were a number of other companies in the US that have been rolling out fibre to the premises, such as Comcast and in particular Google. And Google is well known now for its gigabit fibre to the premises rollouts, and so AT&T was losing market share, and so they've just now gone to fibre to the premises. And in fact, I'd like to give a quote from something that AT&T put to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, just a few months ago. Demand is growing faster for broadband speeds than AT&T or anyone else, for that matter, can deliver with fibre to the node. So their recognition is that fibre to the node is not able to cope with the increasing demands that that people have for bandwidth, and so there's been that change to fibre to the premises away from fibre to the node. Now, you also mentioned a moment ago the UK and
Switzerland and
Germany. Yes. Now, those companies were actually mentioned in the one of the corporate plans from NBN Co as examples. The NBN Co 2016 corporate plan had a small section on overseas activities, and it mentioned those few examples, and not much else, I must say. And I have in front of me here, I can show you later on if you like, or put it on record, a bar chart showing the penetration of optical fibre in Europe in countries, as a bar chart showing the height of the bar is the penetration of optical fibre. And there are something like 20 countries in Europe that have more fibre than the UK and Germany. It turns out Germany and the UK are real laggards in Europe when it comes to fibre to the premises. So it's not a good example to be picking the laggards when you're thinking about what's going on in other parts of the world. Okay. So in fact, my argument would be that was not a good comparison. And there are many other countries, including Russia and many of the Scandinavian countries, that have very large and expanding fibre to the premises rollout.
So why is it that the UK, Germany and Switzerland are doing fibre to copper? How does that, what's the basis for that?
Time.
Yeah.
May I come in on that? The reason that those three countries are doing fibre to the copper was primarily because they started upgrading their networks far before anyone else. Okay. So they started upgrading their networks in that period in the early 2000s. And many other countries like us put it off. So the issue is that was their investment in fibre to the copper in the early 2000s and subsequently valid? Yes. And that was because they would be well into the lifetime of those technologies before new technologies came on stream. And that's the important point, was that back in 2009-10, industry, engineers, academia could see technologies that are going to be rolled out between 2010 and 2025. And in fact, one of the main reasons that AT&T did its spectacular backflip was because new technology called next generation PON2 has now come onto the market. And essentially that's a third generation fibre to the premises system. Not a first generation, not a second generation, third generation. And it was the advent of this new next generation PON2, the capabilities and the decreased costs of using that technology, that finally pushed the numbers, if you like, across into the fibre to the premises column, saying this is advantageous. Now, people like myself and colleagues and others have been arguing since 2009-10 that if we're going to do a new network, that's got to have a 30-year lifetime. And we can see that by 2015, 5 or 6 years ahead from 2009, that new technologies would come on stream that would make investment in fibre to the node unwarranted, given that essentially from today, 2016 on, every dollar spent on copper is essentially 20 cents more expensive than a dollar spent on fibre to the premise. And over the next 10 years, that gap is going to grow and grow and grow. So AT&T has demonstrated clearly, even though we're late, they've demonstrated clearly that we should not continue down the copper path. Now, if I may, on one other point, there has recently been a lot of hoo-ha made about a lab test that was done by Comcast about 10 gigabit per second HFC. It was a lab test. That technology, if ever, would not hit the streets for 10 years. Now, we've got 10 gigabit per second, next generation PON2, being rolled out in Portugal, in the United States. It's being rolled out in China. It's being rolled out around the world. It's here today. Okay. Lab tests and HFC and Comcast, all that sort of stuff is just unfortunate fantasy, and it's very disappointing.
Hey.
Very disappointing to see senior executives from NBN Co running around carrying on as if all their problems have been solved.
Can I just, I get annoyed a bit about the NBN debate just as a private citizen, because as an engineer, what you need is a requirement specification, and the requirement of the NBN was primarily to get a more even distribution of bandwidth across the country. And I entirely agree with that. I think that's a laudable political aim. And the way to do that, well, there's a variety of ways to do it, but what you should do is compare the life cycle costs of these various technologies. And sometimes satellite wins and sometimes fibre wins. I'm broadly in agreement with the rest of the panel that if there is a new path or a greenfield site, then obviously you should put fibre in, because it is, demonstrably more future-proof than other technologies. But I also think that if you're going to dig up everybody's front garden in the suburbs just to put a new type of electromagnetic carrier across the garden to carry a relatively small bandwidth, then that could be a waste of money in some people's eyes. That why not keep that cable going across the front yard? Why not keep the cable going under the house and up through the floorboards? That all works fine. And then all you need to do is split up the HFC network a little bit more on a finer granularity and put more fibre feeds in. And for a lot less money, you've improved the internet of many, many people. And my point about engineers, I suppose I was going to lead on to the point that when you're running a telecoms company, you shouldn't be planning for what's going to happen before 2020. You should be planning how you're going to have a telecoms company that works forever. And that involves having a workforce that's confident that it's going to be with you. Otherwise, you get the situation like I have, that one student's gone to Apple, one's gone to Google Fibre, another's gone to Bell Labs. All the good brains disappear from Australia. So, yes, fibre is good. I think these comparisons with other countries sort of miss the point slightly, in that what we need to do is think about what capacity is needed where. Now, 40 megabits per second is probably good for streaming TV. I doubt that any new apartment in Melbourne would need a 4K TV, because the pixels would be bigger than the room. You need to sit a long way away from it to appreciate it. The arguments that we're going to have a family with 5 people and they're all going to have their own TV and it's all going to be streaming all the time. My daughter went to Japan and there was such a family, and the son hadn't spoken to the mother for 20 years. Is that the society you're trying to create with all this internet? Or should we be solving the problems that really need fixing? Like when I download myself every day to go to work, it takes an hour on one of Melbourne's linear car parks. Perhaps we should be spending a bit of thinking time on how to free up the freeways.
Public Transport Committee's hearing in the next.
Well, you're the government. You do everything. You're omnipotent.
Can we unpack some of this stuff a little
Sure.
bit? Is that all right? So I think all of you at different times have mentioned this concept of future-proofing, and I feel like you just kind of downloaded a couple of quite different ideas on us there. Can we pull apart this future-proofing idea? One of you in your opening statements, I forget who it was talking about, tell me if I got this wrong, a 10 terabyte per second network in between research laboratories. Who was that?
Well, that's what we're doing in our individual labs at Melbourne and RMIT and Monash.
10 TB.
And we want to send signals to each other so we can work out the real world problems, like what happens when a tram goes past the fibre. It affects the polarisation in the fibre.
Yeah.
Can we invent cheap methods of solving that at the receiver? So we can do some really great stuff just using some dark fibre that's plentiful down St Kilda Road. So that's one thing.
So
And I guess Rod's point has always been that if you put a fibre to the home, then you could get 10 terabytes down it. And John Laws gets very excited about this when the Swiss put 26 terabytes per second down a fibre.
Can you do that?
But what would you do with it?
Well, it's 2016. I mean, actually, we've invited you guys to tell us a little bit about what you would do with it. I'm always a bit uncomfortable when we are comparing, potential alternative technology solutions, and we are, the metric that we use is how many 4K TVs can people have at a time.
Yes.
I feel like that fundamentally misunderstands how these networks are going to get used. I do a certain amount of 3D modelling and rendering, so I use a render farm in Switzerland, for example, and, you spend a lot of time tearing your hair out, sending these big files up and waiting for them to come back.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't have a number of 4K TV, metrics by which to gauge that, but the question I want to get to when we come to this concept of future-proofing is how far can this legacy copper network take us? Like, how far can it be pushed before we just hit the capacity limits and say we'd better just get on with actually upgrading it? And that's where the debate in Australia has been stuck. If you can help us unstick it, that would be great. Should we persist with a fibre to the node and an HFC hybrid build, or should we actually just jump to what appears to be scalable and future-proof?
Can I make a...
That's great.
Can I make a comment here? I agree with Professor Lowery's comment about copper being good in a home, and there's a technology that we haven't mentioned here yet, and that's fibre to the what's so-called fibre to the distribution point, using a standard known as G.fast or G.fast or G.fast, some people call it. And the idea there is that the fibre comes all the way almost to the home, but you don't dig up the front garden, and there is a little box that sits in the outside the house, which provides a connection from the fibre to the copper. It's not powered by any external source. It doesn't require connection to the power lines, which has been causing problems for NBN Co just recently, I read, because it's reverse powered from the home via the copper pairs. Now, this is a very new technology which is just being trialled around the world, but it's highly compatible with the concept of taking fibre almost to the home, and either you could either use G.fast with the existing copper pairs under the front garden, or you could put a fibre in if you wanted to for those people who really did want a fibre. And I think that's a really good way forward. And there has been mention made by this of NBN Co executives, although I'm not sure if it's in any of their business plans just yet. But to answer your question, Senator Luddell, my feeling is that to go to fibre to the node is a bad idea, because fibre to the node requires an expensive piece of equipment in the field, powered by the power grid, which is causing problems as we know right now. In fact, the fibre to the node network is going to consume something like 20 megawatts of power additional to the additional drain on the Australian electricity supply when you add all those nodes up. And then to upgrade it, it's necessary to eventually bring the fibre from that node through to either out the front of the house and use fibre to the distribution point, or to the house. So my feeling is that fibre to the node is a bad idea, but there are solutions that don't require necessarily digging up the front garden of every house.
And that's brilliant. That's what we need to think about, is some of these hybrid solutions that give the advantage of the fibre, but also reduce the civil engineering costs.
Now, I'm very interested in what you've just said, Professor Tucker, and I wanted you to talk to me about vectoring, Vplus, and you've mentioned G.fast, which I think is quite embryonic, but very exciting in some respects. Can we talk a little bit about those three things? Because fibre to the node, to the distribution point, and then using can you tell us about how vectoring and Vplus is supposed to work in line with what you've said about G.fast?
Yes. So vectoring, which is a fine tuning, if you like, of what is known as VDSL, very high speed data transmission, which is an upgrade from today's ADSL.
Yep.
And vectoring is a fine-tuning of a technology that's been around for a while that provides just a little bit extra of capability. And the issue with fibre with ADSL, and in fact with fibre to the node, is that on those copper pairs that go from the node to the homes, a lot of them travel alongside each other in a cable, and there is interference from one to the next. And it's that interference which is a major issue in terms of reducing the capacity of the copper to handle the data. Now, the clever thing about vectoring is that the box in the street knows about all the data going down all those lines, and it's able to, when sending data to your house, and it knows what data is going to another house, it's able to change both of them a little bit to reduce that interference. So vectoring is a fine-tuning of VDSL. It gives a little bit of extra capacity out of copper, but it's about at the limit. And the companies that produce vectoring, Alcatel-Lucent, which has recently been taken over by Nokia, they've pointed out that vectoring is about as far as you can go with copper. There's really no way forward in terms of making things any better than vectoring.
And that counts for Vplus too, does it? Which is a Nokia product, as I...
Yes, that's right.
Alcatel product.
Yes, that's
But the problem is this, and that's great explanation, but the problem is people go, oh, copper twisted pairs are terrible because they're at their limit. But the copper twisted pair across your front garden isn't. And so we have to be very careful in these discussions about, not just saying, oh, it's copper versus silica. It's copper in a certain application over a certain distance with a certain number of channels.
Precisely. So let me continue. To answer the second part of your question, the G.fast technology uses a much shorter length of copper, and very little of it is maybe a small bit of it is travelling next to your neighbours, but most of it is by itself in your front garden. So it's not experiencing interference from other signals, and in addition to that, it's quite short, and so there are fewer losses and other imperfections that affect the capability. So it means that with not very sophisticated electronics in that little box that goes in the street, you can get up to a gigabit from that fibre in the front street along the short length of copper into the home, and so it's much, much better than you could ever get with VDSL.
Thank you very much.
If I may, I'd like to just correct a couple of things that my colleagues have just said.
This is good.
Professor Lowery may have been in another country for the last 30 years, which is unfortunate. But the idea of digging up front lawns for something has been done in this country before. We rolled out gas to every home in the country, which required a dirty great big gas pipe into homes, Professor Lowery. The point is...
Not every home.
I remember when we
Still a lot of places haven't got gas.
It's unfortunate. The
I just
situation...
have to
Can I just finish,
there.
please? The point is that in other countries around the world, the idea of putting the fibre up the existing infrastructure is not being done. The fibre is being rolled into houses, around the fences, over concrete work and so forth, using self-install kits and using sheathed fibre. Okay? People need to look at this. There are 3 cities in Europe where the people in the cities actually rolled the fibre themselves out of their homes into the street. Now, I agree with my colleague on the point of fibre to the distribution point. I've written about it in the past. I proposed it in 2013 as an alternative to fibre to the node. And then it could be left up to the homeowner if they wanted to use either the existing copper or to use fibre into the home. Digging up people's front lawns and so forth is a nonsense and is not sensible in this discussion, simply because the gas pipe explanation for the nation's benefit of using gas rather than electricity is justification for doing that. Just quickly a couple of other points. Yes, if I can go back to the self-install kits. There is no reason why people can't self-install the fibre from their home to the street. It's been done overseas. Australians are very competent and capable people. We can do it too. It would move the process of actually rolling this network out much faster. And I think that Australians would get on board if they were given the opportunity. But it means you've got to get the fibre past the homes. And G.fast is a valid alternative to what is being done now. My argument has been and always will be that fibre to the node is unjustified. G.fast is justified. Fibre to premises is justified. My belief is that if you put fibre past houses and say you can either do G.fast or self-install the fibre, 99% of Australians will self-install the fibre.
By self-install, do we mean ring somebody with a van to come around and do it, or do you mean get out with a trenching kit and do it yourself?
Well, you don't need to trench. You can do it yourself, and you don't need to trench.
I can barely even get my router to work some days. What do we mean by self-install?
Well, it simply means that you ask your neighbours if you've got two left thumbs to help, which is what they did in Europe, or you ring a tradesperson to do it, or you do it yourself. And you don't need to trench to do self-install fibre. I mean, it's like everyone that's got electric gates in the front of their houses now. You've got a cable from the electric gate running back to your house. And if you look at how most of those are installed, they're installed around the fence, and they're normally just laid a couple of inches below, below the top around the fence.
It's like installing a bit of retic pipe or something.
That sounds like a roof insulation type disaster. I mean, you have to put
it's
electric
the
cables
standard
in
industry
conduits
way, Professor
that far
Lowery,
down.
right? That is the standard industry way.
I don't think the cable's going to explode into flame.
I guess one important point to make here, one important point to make here is that the current wiring rules forbid the public to do connections using the copper pairs. The reason being that if they make a mistake and connect a high voltage to it, the high voltage can go into the system and cause damage elsewhere. But fibre, so there's no problem with fibre. It's just glass. And there are no rules, and you can do it yourself.
Yep, absolutely.
But certainly on your electric gates, that's a very highly dangerous situation, because when the wind blows the fence down, it rips the wires out of the connection box, and you've got live wires in the front garden.
They're low voltage, 12 volts, Professor Lowery.
Well, let's come back to the NBN.
You obviously don't have an electric fence, do you?
Let's come back to the NBN.
Yes.
I think we've sort of canvassed global comparisons. I think we've gone to fibre to the distribution point. The question I want to ask around, and hopefully to finish off this question, if you then move to fibre to the distribution point, how future-proofed is that?
It depends exactly how it's installed, but it can be quite future-proof, because fibre to the distribution point basically means that the fibre is very close to the home.
Right.
It might require a little bit of extra fibre to the front fence and then the self-installation process. So it's quite future-proof in the sense that there's not much extra effort to go to fibre to the premises if necessary.
In the future, we will want, and I'm now going to move to Dr. Glance so I can talk about health for a moment. We do want a circumstance where for someone who's ageing in their own home, they will want to have capacity to talk through a television to their nurse who may be, in the same town or not, to talk to have sensors so that people know that people are moving, all the technology that is going to be able to provide very good quality monitoring and care of a person living by themselves in their own home. What capacity is needed for all of those bits, and the bits that we haven't even invented yet, to ensure that someone can live in their own home?
If I may address something, at the Institute we play with a number of futuristic applications in the area of aged care, healthcare kind of things. So we often find a lot of people use 4K video as an example of showing what is the capability of the network. But what we're finding is latency, the time it takes to get a transaction done over the network, is starting to be the major limitation in terms of user experience and ability to deliver serious services. For example, we're trialing a virtual reality as a basis for helping quadriplegic to have a very systematic way of rehearsing their lung exercises, because if they don't stop doing lung breathing exercises, they have a very quick downward direction in terms of health, because lung fails, heart fails, and very quick things. But we find we're using that as a way of helping them to socialize with people who have similar things, have a group singing. And just having a music interactions online itself requires significant latency restrictions. And we need to provide bandwidth. By providing bandwidth, it in a way deals with that latency issue. So that goes to same thing with many other healthcare things, because as illustrated earlier on, we click and wait, and it cannot do in that kind of context. And as we have lots of people, in the case, for example, quadriplegic, it has a very unfair distribution in the regional towns because a lot of people use roads and they have lots of accidents and as a result of it. But they are the type of services we wanted to do because it would significantly alter the footprint of the healthcare, for example, or aged care in the future. So I think when we look at actually serious applications on the back of the NBN, we start to see significant expectation on bandwidth and, more importantly, the latency, how long it takes to deliver that bandwidth. And I think that's one of the things, this is my personal thing, we fixated on the architecture and the technology options rather than saying here is a gold standard that we would like to deliver to Australia in terms of connectivity and the bandwidth, and let the decisions on per city, per area, what is the appropriate technology of delivering it. I think that would probably see a lot of these political footballing out and actually have serious goalposts in terms of deployment. I find it very difficult to see after the strategic review and after we accepted that we're going to do not fiber to the premises, but we're going to do HFC, I didn't see a step change in terms of deployment plan. In fact, actually it still downgraded the projection of NBN. So we're actually delaying the Australians' chance to have access to broadband, even we have relaxed the architectural options, even we have relaxed what's the bandwidth they have to offer to the students. So that is the game that we have to lift. We have to go back to what we promised. Find ways of accelerating. On average, most Australians should have these, and we should reduce the gap between peak and the average speed of connectivity throughout Australia, regardless of what is the individual architectural and technology choices. And once we focus on these are the type of services we're going to deliver, we're going to rely on NBN to deliver mission critical services, we're going to rely on NBN to deliver government healthcare to regional cities, we're going to rely on NBN to activate regional economic and industry development using IoT, then we need to be fixated on making sure as quickly as possible we achieve the original goals of delivering NBN. We should move away from fixating again on architecture because it changes time to time. NTT figured out fiber to the premises is the way to outpace incoming competitor in 2004 when I was there. So AT&T realized later, because there are demographic and city density, population density changes from country to country, city to city, region to city, village to village. So therefore, it actually complicates that decision. But definitely, if you fix it on only future proofing, fiber to the premises wins, and other derivatives. But as a country, I think if we set these are the metrics NBN should deliver. This is the average connection speed that we aim to do. This will lift our international ranking. Then that's what it is. Then the technology, architecture, and the delivery should be geared towards delivering that goal.
So I think
Dr. Glantz and then Dr.
Yes, thanks.
I think one of the issues as well is that when we talk about capacity and speed, we talk about it in the ideal setting of an individual sitting in a home unaffected by what everybody else is doing. And the truth is that that's not going to be the scenario we're going to see. So whilst people, and this is what we saw in the remote communities using satellite, is that there's contention. And there's the fact that you're competing with somebody whilst you're doing a video conference. And I know there are mechanisms to try and get around this with other types of use of the network. And so if everybody is using video and telehealth and other things in their houses, using Internet of Things to monitor whether somebody has fallen over, then it's the fact that it's not just one isolated house that's doing that, it's a whole neighborhood. And so when we talk about capacity and these aren't necessarily futuristic things. I mean, we're talking about, I realize that companies use this as a marketing ploy, but 2020 is only 4 years away, that we will see wide-scale deployments of Internet of Things and home monitoring, because we have to. There are no alternatives to that given the current demands on the health system and other infrastructure. So this is really the point, is that it's not just about an isolated person sitting in the home. I might have a 100 megabit connection currently through Telstra Big Pond, but that changes depending on what other people are doing in my street.
What worries me, Dr. Glance, is if we move to having people's lives dependent on a piece of technology, if it fails, the implication is not that, oh, I can't watch the telly. This is a bigger implication. So I live in regional Queensland. I'm a late convert to therapy over the internet, but I have seen, when we were in government actually, we had a little program that provided therapy services for children who had hearing and sight impairment in regional Queensland. And when I saw that therapy being delivered from a therapist who was sitting in Mount Isa with a little girl who was sitting in Townsville, I became a convert. So that's a good thing, but we have to be sure that it's going to work. Because if I've got my dad in a house in a country town, I want to know that the system that's looking after him is foolproof.
Absolutely.
And so that's where I'm up to in the conversation about telehealth. I mean, I've been on Saibai Island in the Torres Strait, closest place to New Guinea, where there is a connection so that a person can get an X-ray in an X-ray machine and be that X-ray of their chest to find out if they've got tuberculosis can be sent to Brisbane. That's a good thing. When it doesn't work, that's a bad thing.
No, absolutely. And so when you're looking for scenarios, again, these are scenarios from the past 10 years. They're not future scenarios of even looking at the great image, through example of radiological imaging. In WA, we were talking about at the time having a centralised scheme of having all radiological images on a central platform to be able to distribute to hospitals or anybody who wanted it from whatever provider. Those are the types of scenarios that you want to be able to deliver today. You cannot do that on the current infrastructure, and you want the ability to be able to do that now, not even in 5 years' time. The images themselves are extremely large files, and absolutely, they're, in terms of even doing that within a hospital over the network, proved problematic within the new hospitals in WA. So it's these are real problems today to achieve things that we should really already be accepting as the normal.
So what I hear a lot in the debate is, let's think about the maximum possible use that someone might have of this network, and let's multiply it by the number of premises in Australia. It's clear from the hospital example that that's the wrong way of thinking, because hospitals don't move. MRI machines don't move. They're huge things. They need lots of infrastructure. Radiology and path labs don't move. They all sit together in a big building. I've got friends in them. And so that's when you need a link from A to B, or A to B to C, or a special dedicated network for that, which you can buy from people who have dark fibre. It doesn't mean that everybody in the home might one day get an MRI machine in the front lounge. For health monitoring, I went for a job interview in 1986, which was a thing where you wore it around your neck and you pressed a button if you'd fallen over. That worked over the old telephone system. And it doesn't require many bits per second to say whether someone's horizontal or vertical. So I think there's got to be some good metrics. Things have got to be fit for use. You've got to decide who needs what, who's in a fixed position, who might pop up. I was talking to some people on the next table last night, and they have a publishing business, and they were complaining that when they download a 500-page textbook with all the beautiful graphics in it, that takes 10 minutes. Well, maybe they need to pay a little bit more than the rest of us. Maybe it ought to be like Uber, that if everybody wants to download their movie at exactly the same time, they have to wait a bit. But with a bit of forethought, they could plan downloading the movie. They could have a cheap night rate, those sort of things. So I agree, shared systems are a bit problematic. I'd love the Monash Freeway to come straight to my front door and my driveway. That would be great. Well, it wouldn't really, but
I wouldn't want
in
that.
reality, the amount of concrete used would mean there would be no room for anyone's house. And it's a bit the same with the NBN, that you can have this dream of providing enormous amounts of bandwidth to everybody every second, on demand, on whim. But it costs an awful lot of money.
Does it?
And it takes an awful lot of
It's
time.
going to cost
Does
them,
it?
It's costing them more to retrofit using HFC and fibre to the node.
Well,
So
not that
I
it,
kinda
not,
don't
it's
buy that.
costing much less because it's installed. Why rip up something
not.
that
It's not
works?
costing
I don't
much
know if
less.
Okay,
You
okay.
are.
Let's talk
You mean
about
the installed
We're
stuff?
up to $56 billion to
Yes.
patch this thing together that's underway at the moment, which is actually more than Mr. Quigley and the original NBN team had estimated was going to cost to put fibre to the premises to 93%.
So wasn't there
of
a
the
report
country.
with a maintenance cost of between 3 and 700 million a year for the copper network, and it was like 200 to 300 million a year for the fibre network?
That's wrong.
They're in
That's
enormous-
wrong.
Telstra
Okay.
admitted it was close to $1 billion. It's for the copper now, Arthur.
Dr. Gregory,
Okay.
can we just unpack this cost question?
If I may, can I just address the medical for a minute?
Okay,
Go back.
we'll do medical for a couple more minutes and
Just-
then go to cost.
The important thing, if I may say, is that we're all too focused on the old things, the old medical alarms and so forth. And that's disappointing because what we're talking about is the future. And the NBN is the future. We're talking about therapy, virtual reality. We're talking about being able to do more. Terabit per second virtual reality systems where people with PTSD or some other type of problem are able to do in-home therapy. You know, we need to move beyond thinking about systems that were connected to telephone lines. There are so many possible ways that we can use the NBN for health and education. And in particular, we're talking about health. There are systems being developed now for group therapy and so forth in the virtual reality world and so on. And it would be good for people in remote Australia to be able to participate in these systems. And that's why I would just like to go back to something I forgot to say. We need to order a third satellite immediately. They take 6 years to get into the air. We need a third one ordered now. It is going to be very evident to most of us by now that those two satellites are going to be heavily congested. I strongly have argued and strongly agree that we should be using those satellites to facilitate connectivity to planes, trains, boats. For two reasons. One is that a person on a plane might be sitting there looking at YouTube, but a person on a plane is equally might be working. And a person on a boat, it's their place of work. And a person on a train or a truck, it's their place of work. They can have health and other problems and they need to talk to their families. You know, I've grown up, and you talk about regional areas. I mean, I used to live on the Gregory River, and that's a place to find on a map. And once you've found it, you'll realise that that's about as far as you can get from anywhere. And we had nothing, right? And if someone got sick, that was it. That was the end of it. So I can only strongly stress that we need more satellite, but we also need to think about the future. And these things are not a dream. These things are being developed today. And I just wish the debate would move past 4K TV and would move past medical monitoring systems that we've had for 50 years.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, let's go to the question of cost. And there seems to be a difference of opinion about cost. Did you want to talk through this costing debate?
I was going to come to a different question, so I'm happy if you want to take on the cost question.
Let's talk about the cost then.
Can I ask a question about cost?
All right, off you go.
So, gentlemen, in all of our discussions, and we've all got a view, when we talk about cost, I think we have to start from the position of a benchmark. And we all see a data rate that we all, I hope, individually feel is adequate for each premise. Now, I'd like to discuss what the benchmark is and what we think the benchmark should be as of today. We can pontificate about the future later. And what the cost of that should be, and someone suggests to me 53 megabits a second, I think is a figure from you, Professor Tucker. What should we reasonably expect to pay for that? And when I look at the international benchmarks, and we've just discussed this with Dr. Gregory, we talk about, particularly in Aboriginal communities, wanting the health facilities. It's very expensive to the middle of Western Australia, I can tell you, from personal experience. And I take it, Dr. Gregory, that was Goldsworthy you were living in, was it, on the De Grey River?
No, I was living on a station called Warralong.
I know it well. Yes.
Yeah, not far from Goldsworthy.
Yeah, so the point about cost is how much comparison do we make from a demographic point of view and a geography point of view from Australia? Because I think, again, like always, we're pretty unique. The American and European examples, the South Korean example, the Japanese example, I mean, I can virtually walk around some of these countries. Now, you know, we have a huge differential in terms of distance, in terms of services, electricity, etc. But what's a fair thing for our demographic in terms of data rate, and what do we think is a fair cost for that?
I would actually disagree with respect, Senator, about the need to have a set of benchmark for today, because I think that because the world is constantly changing and because there is this constant growth in new technologies emerging and constant growth in the amount of data that's being generated, used and stored, that to set a benchmark at a particular point in time is perhaps not the right way to go about it. We need to think about what the growth needs to be and where we need to be in the future. If we set a benchmark for today and set up technologies that will provide it, we might end up having stranded assets that we can't be upgraded later on.
Professor, tell me how we are supposed to budget for that.
Well, I think what we need to do is we need to think the longer term. We need to think what we want in 2020, 2025.
I have to plan. I've got the forward estimates.
Yes.
I've got to have some concrete.
You do it once, you do it right, you do it with fibre.
Thank you, Stephen. So he's there after all. He hasn't gone to sleep. Of course, when we talk about costs, we're talking about peak funding. Typically, there's capital cost and there's peak funding. And the peak funding is the maximum amount you spend before the revenue starts to then kick in and bring things back to a point where you're actually making a profit. So it's a long-term issue, and we need to think about the peak funding and how it pans out over a long period of time. And as new services come into play, it's likely that there'll be increased revenues through new services that will generate revenue streams that we haven't thought of today. So, but if you want to think about a benchmark, there have been a number of studies, and I really haven't got time to go into it now, but there have been a number of studies about what bandwidths people need. One of them was done for the Vertigan report, done by Vertigan in 2014. And there was another one which I've referred to recently in some papers I've written, a Van der Vorst, a group in Europe.
A Dutch university.
Yes. Yes,
a Dutch university did a good paper.
That's the one, Senator Conroy's, the Technical University of Eindhoven. And their projections for future demand were more than an order of magnitude higher than what the Vertigan report had projected. And in fact, the Vertigan report had projected bandwidth requirements which were less than what we have today. So it was really quite questionable about whether that was appropriate or not. So there are graphs from these studies done by groups of academics, industry people, sociologists that have looked at future demand and growth. And they've come up with these graphs. And typical numbers would be for 2020, about the time that the NBN will be completed, more than 100 megabits will be required in a typical European country. And of course, the fibre to the node can't provide that. So the danger here is that we're building a network which might be good today in 2016, but by 2020 and certainly by 2025 won't be...
So 100 megabits per premise?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, what do we get for that?
What do we get for that?
What does that enable us to do, house by house?
Well, it will enable us to expand our access to the kinds of services we've talked about. Not everyone will use the full 100 megabits, but it will mean that it will be available for those who need it. And we're talking about premises here, so it's businesses as well as homes, the small businesses that will need it for uploading their 3D designs or whatever. There'll be those kinds of capabilities available.
It's kind of the case, isn't it, that not every house uses the maximum electricity that the electricity distribution network provides, but you better install it.
No, we don't provide to each house a wire which is just big enough for the average amount of electricity per house.
Otherwise, you
we have electricity wires that are big enough for the maximum.
We're starting to run. Oh,
Yeah, I just want one question around the cost of retrofitting, and is there some way you could point to us to find what the cost of retrofitting fibre to the node will be to get the 100 megabits that you're talking about, rather than talk about we're going to get.
To upgrade fibre to the node, you need to then take the fibres all the way to the home, and the cost is the same as it would have been as if you'd done it in the first place. And you've got to throw away that box in the street that costs a lot of money, and it's wasted.
Thank you, Professor.
So we've only got you gentlemen for another 10 minutes or so. So I just wondered, while we've got you here, you're in the position of steering policy, given where we are in the electoral cycle, given where the politics are, given the stage of the network build of different kinds of technologies. What's your advice to the government if you get to choose which way to steer the ship from here? Maybe if we could just hear briefly from each of you and keep it as nuggety as you can. What should we do with this network? What would be the smartest thing that we could do from here?
I would say we would keep the HFC. We would patch it up a bit where it's working, and in the future we could go to fibre. I like the G.fast idea. I think meeting at the front gate's a good idea, like the Water Board does with me. I think we should concentrate on areas of the country that don't have reliable internet, and reliability is a key thing. You don't want it to be 95%, as I saw in one report. You want it to be, 5 nines or whatever. And I'd use your money prudently. I'd extend the time frame of the NBN in order to do this. This will give longevity for jobs, which is important in people's lives. I don't see that there is a huge problem in spending money on maintaining things. It keeps people in work. It keeps the network looked after and monitored. So less speed, please.
Less speed?
Less speed in the rollout, but not less speed to the customer, but a sensible use of the net with probably some differential fees on charging for different services, and some software that guarantees that essential services always get priority. So some clever stuff.
Thanks, Professor.
So I think we should definitely make sure the greenfield sites are fibre-ready, fiberized, fibre to the premises. And I think that will prevent us from converting today's greenfield sites into brownfield. And brownfield is a widening gap in terms of what is needed to be deployed, what is not currently deployed. And I haven't seen any real progress in the increase in activating NBN because of the HFC is in the part of the mixer. So I'm not that convinced that whether HFC is actually changing the deployment plan, but anything to accelerate the deployment would be good. Third satellite, but with the new technology of flexible beams, because at the moment fixed beams is the 2 satellites going in. If it is a flexible beam technology, it can be provided to add flexible bandwidth to areas and regions where there is a major issue or a major bandwidth requirement. You can flexibly allocate. So that's probably 3 things I would make.
Thank you.
My message is simple, and that is cancel fibre to the node as soon as possible and replace it with fibre to the premises. And we didn't get into much detail about the costs, but I'd like to correct my colleague as well and point out that on this side, my colleague on this side of the table, that in fact, if we learn from the New Zealanders and work out cheaper ways to install fibre to the premises using more modern techniques than are being used at the moment, that the cost calculations turn out that a fibre to the premises network would not cost much more than fibre to the node. And I'm also in favour of the third satellite, especially now that Qantas is going to start streaming videos on Qantas flights, sapping out the bandwidth from the NBN.
Yeah, I think that, again, I would agree with Professor Tucker on cancelling the situation and responding to the current economic demands that we find ourselves in. All of these decisions that were made even 2 years ago are no longer the case. We have an economy which is in a different situation. We have a Prime Minister asking us to innovate, and we have technologies like Netflix and other companies coming in and changing the landscape about how we use those technologies. If we're going to be expected to do that as an economy, as a public, then we absolutely need that infrastructure to enable that. That may not have been justified 5 years ago or even 2 years ago. It's certainly justified now. We should follow the example of private enterprise, in the case of AT&T, other countries, and change the plan to fit the needs that we see today in the current context in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you.
I would reiterate the third satellite as being very important because of the time lag. I believe that the investment in the satellites has been extremely important for regional and remote Australia. I again support fully fibre to the premises. I believe that that it is possible to get the build cost down significantly with approaches that I've seen around the world. As an alternative, I would fall back on fibre to the distribution point. I would cancel fibre to the node as quickly as possible. That would mean yesterday. I would immediately launch a broad committee to review what is to happen to the NBN after 2020, and also to look at what legislation and regulation associated with that would improve competitive environment in Australia for the telecommunications market. I consider the current telecommunications market to be an absolute mess. And so I believe that we need a broad-based review to achieve some sort of working way forward. I think that what we've been hedging around is what's the purpose of the NBN. And so I'd like to conclude by reminding us all that what is the NBN's purpose. I mean, we're spending all this money. And the purpose of the NBN is not just simply to provide people with bits of cable so that they can watch movies. The purpose of the NBN is to take us beyond universal service. It is to take us to what should be known as universal access. We have now moved into an era where every Australian needs to be connected to the digital network reliably, all of the time, at every day. And the problem that we have today is that a large number of Australians can't afford it, or they have no fixed address. They're itinerant, they're homeless, they're the poor, they're the socially and economically disadvantaged. They live in regional remote areas and they live in a shack. And I believe that the reason for the NBN, my reason for the NBN, is that we need to define universal access as being the goal. Now, speed and all the rest of it is one issue, and I agree with that. But the goal of the Australian government has got to be to provide universal access to all Australians, to the digital world, for health, for education, to access government services and so forth. And for that reason, I believe that to help facilitate that, because Wi-Fi is a ubiquitous thing that many homeless and itinerant people have, they can't afford mobile cellular, but they have a device that will do Wi-Fi, is that NBN Co should be asked to roll out a national Wi-Fi network, a national wholesale Wi-Fi network immediately, okay? And as part of that, councils, local government, state, federal governments will be able to facilitate free Wi-Fi access for the homeless, the disadvantaged, the socially and economically disadvantaged. I feel that we're missing the point of the NBN debate. Thank you.
Gentlemen, that's been a very informative session. I very much thank you all for your contributions. I also thank you for the way you've interacted. That's been that's been terrific. I really fear for the Hansard reporters having to work out some of the language that we've used. So you may be contacted by our people trying to understand what a terabyte might be and how to spell it. That's the easy one, I think. But so thank you very much for your contribution today. We'll now have a short break and we'll come back at 11:15. Please join us for a cup of coffee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.